Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and students, it's the last panel of the day, and it's my particular pleasure and honor to be able to chair it. Thanks to the marvelous work of Sebastian and his team, you all have the necessary information about our distinguished speakers in writing, in color, at your hand. They should already have been introduced in detail this morning. Werner, Pascha, of course, is someone I'd love to introduce to you, at least with a sentence, because we had the great, well, occasional pleasure and the long process of negotiating the Alliance for Research on East Asia Ruhr between Duisburg and Bochum over the last couple of years, and this is why I'm particularly glad that it has become really a regular habit now of having you here for our events, which is great because it strengthens the situation of East Asian studies and the national economy of East Asia here in the place. I have a rather strong invitation to try to keep the 5:30 deadline, probably acknowledging that people from academia are a bit flexible when it gets to keeping their own deadlines, to be able to have everyone at the dinner afterwards. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Professor Dr. BAVA, was unable to attend today, so which I would hope gives us the opportunity to have a first intermediate summing up, bring together all those interesting bits and pieces from today. Wow. I think I have an urgent appointment right now. Too many points for me. This is why I would kindly ask the two presenters to stick to their original 15 to 20 minutes time frame. Thanks. Look forward to yours again.
Right, thank you. I'll just step up here because I have a very simple PowerPoint slide. Okay, thank you. Great. So, thanks once again to the organizers and sponsors for the opportunity to be here and talk a little bit about the EU-Asia connectivity strategy from a so-called Australian or Indo-Pacific perspective. You probably already know that I'm not Australian, I just happen to live there. Although I'm very proud to say I was recently granted permanent residency status, so I'm getting closer to becoming an Aussie. But nevertheless, I hope I can represent some Australian views in relation to this important initiative by the EU. I mean, to begin with, coming from a relatively remote, underpopulated island landmass on the, the underside of the Earth, I think Australians readily understand the necessity, the imperative of connectivity, right? Australia could not possibly hope to be in the global top 10 in GDP per capita, have the world's 12th largest economy, be among the top 15 destinations for foreign direct investment in the world, rank 17th in foreign direct investment of its own abroad, and sit at the G20 table if it were not for connectivity with the world beyond its shores. Although I think sometimes Australians don't quite understand that sometimes. But it's more than just an economic matter, though. Interestingly, in Australia, more than a quarter of Australia's residents, or about 7 million people, were born abroad. I'm one of them. And approximately 1 in 2 Australians have a parent born overseas. It's interesting. So Australia, I think, has always had to be connected. And of course, this built-in appreciation for connectivity is all the more important for Australia's relations with Asia, right? The country's top 5 export markets in order are China, Japan, the United States, Republic of Korea, and India. And the top 5 import markets are China, the US, Korea, Japan, and Thailand. About 10 or 15% of the Australian population claims Asian ancestry. And these are led by people of Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Sri Lankan descent. 1 in 10 persons in Australia speak an Asian language at home. And the second most widely spoken tongue in Australia is Mandarin Chinese, of course. And it's quite striking. You walk down the streets of any major city or any major neighborhood in Sydney, and you constantly hear Mandarin Chinese. It's very interesting. So clearly, I think Australians get it. They understand what Europe is about as they have launched this connectivity strategy. All the more so as Australia, I think, shares with Europe this sense of trepidation, this sense of uncertainty and contestation, which has descended upon our international system over the past 5 or 10 years, and I think still believes that it is going to be through connectivity, through more engagement with Asia, not less, that some of the challenges that this uncertainty and contestation present can be resolved. So I think we can say, by and large, that this initiative should be welcomed by Australia and others in the region, but, and as I sort of alluded to earlier this morning, there's going to be some concerns remaining as to the precise content of this new initiative and how and whether the strategy is going to align with other priorities and activities on the part of the EU. So I thought in my remaining minutes we could talk about sort of the reasons why you can expect a welcome for this initiative from Australia, but then let's point to some specific, I would say, remaining problems or question marks that the EU and its representatives, I think, will want to work through as they promote this initiative with Australia. So first of all, most importantly, the initiative is sensible because it's meeting such a spectacularly necessary need for infrastructure development in Asia. And we heard the figures earlier today from the Asian Development Bank stating that between 2016 and 2030, something on the range of $1.7 trillion per year is going to be needed to maintain momentum, eradicate poverty, and respond to climate change. Australia cannot possibly make a dent in those needs by itself. The total amount of Australian money invested overseas in 2017 was only about US 1.7 trillion, and nearly half of that figure was invested in just 3 highly developed economies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan. No developing economy in Asia ranks in the top 14 destinations for Australian investment. So, Australia is doing very little, in fact, to help with this infrastructural challenge. So obviously, when Europe comes along and says, we are here to help, and we're prepared to invest some serious money, I think Australia would applaud that and would want to do everything it could to facilitate it. Secondly, it's not only what, in terms of money, Europe brings to the table in this, but how it's going to be spent. And that also is welcome, obviously, in Australia, because, according to the policy documents, this strategy is going to be informed by principles of sustainable, comprehensive, and international rules-based connectivity. The words international rules-based is music to the ears of Australians. Australia, much like small and medium-sized countries here in Europe, relies very heavily on this notion. And they thrive and succeed because they are small powers when there's a level playing field, when there is regulatory quality, sustainable, comprehensive, international rules-based connectivity, very, very welcome. Thirdly, to the degree that this initiative is seen or believed to be, in part, a way of balancing China, that too is going to be welcomed in a place like Australia. Now, of course, the EU strategy does not explicitly state this intention, but nonetheless, in one of the strategy's few direct references to China, the connectivity strategy sends a strong signal to Beijing about the EU's expectations that China will play by the rules. That strategy says this, quote, with China, the EU should strengthen the existing cooperation on the respective infrastructure and development cooperation initiatives, promote the implementation of principles of market access and a level playing field, as well as rely on international standards within initiatives on connectivity. So that's the EU's message to China. And it's one, obviously, with which Australia would strongly agree. In that same, or in a more recent document, that is to say the recent communication last month from the EU about China, we see similar language with which Australia would also agree, saying China is simultaneously in different policy areas a cooperation partner with whom the EU has closely aligned objectives, a negotiation partner with whom the EU needs to find a balance of interests, an economic competitor in the pursuit of technological leadership, and this is the headline, systemic rival, promoting an alternative models of governance. I think the current leadership in Australia would agree very much with that characterization of where the relationship needs to go with China in the months and years ahead. And to the degree that the EU-Asia connectivity strategy contributes to that kind of future relationship with China, again, I think Australia welcomes it. I realize I haven't even been using. So we see a meeting of critical need, exporting the European way, balancing China. Okay. A fourth point, though, in terms of Australian perceptions, I think we need to be clear about, is that while the strategy makes sense, and it generally aligns with Australian interests and values, and offers a welcome new alternative for much needed resources in the region, you don't need to be a Eurosceptic to recognize that the EU faces enormous challenges. We talked about them this morning. We don't need to go through them step by step. It's too depressing. But I think some questions would be in the back of Australian minds, given these many challenges, both internally and in Europe's immediate neighborhood. Does it have the bandwidth? Does the European Union have the bandwidth and the resources to move off of the page, the rhetorical page, in relation to connectivity, and make the kinds of investments which the connectivity strategy suggests are possible? And I think some partners in the region will be waiting to see, right? Not wanting to jump ahead of themselves, but rather waiting to see how serious is the EU really about this connectivity strategy. So looking ahead, what suggestions might a semi-Australian suggest for the connectivity strategy going forward? I'd be interested to hear more from our European friends, the degree to which this strategy can be properly linked up and leveraged with other existing similar and like-minded undertakings in the region, right? So, you know, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is a Japan-India initiative, the Japan Bank of International Cooperation, I list a whole bunch in this paper, other ongoing, mostly focused on infrastructure development, which would seem to be likely or useful partners with which the EU could coordinate and possibly gain synergies from in delivering the infrastructure needs in the region. At a minimum, obviously, those who are going to be in charge of this connectivity strategy are going to have to sit down with countries like the United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Canada, New Zealand, who are already undertaking infrastructure development projects in the region to make sure that we reduce redundancies, right? That we're coordinated and working together, and where possible, actually joining forces to get more bang out of the euro, or more bang out of the buck for the initiatives which we can develop. And there are a slew of these, as was already mentioned, and I'm just hopeful, I presume, that those who are going to be taking charge of this initiative going forward are going to be undertaking the necessary consultations and coordination with all of these other initiatives. I was thinking that the G20 summit in Osaka, maybe it's a bit too late now, it's only 2 months away, but the G20 summit in Osaka in June this year might present an excellent opportunity for representatives of the EU to stand in front of some cameras with, maybe representatives from the United States, from Japan, and others, and put forward a concrete example of coordinated infrastructure development activity which links up the EU and other like-minded partners in the region. That would be a big win, I would think, for this connectivity strategy on a very high platform. It would get all sorts of coverage, and I would think that virtually all the partners in the G20 would be extremely supportive if the EU were to do something like that. We'll have to just wait and see. Of course, we also heard today that I believe it was Francois who said that the EU already has a lot of activity going on in the region. To what degree have the formulators of the connectivity strategy thought through how to insert that strategy into these other major programs and investments, right? So that you get a brand momentum going about the connectivity strategy, but basing it on things that you don't have to invent. They're already there. The EU-Japan, new trade agreement would be one obvious one. ASEM has been mentioned as another one. The EU dialogue with ASEAN is another one. The so-called strategic partnerships which EU has with countries like China, India, Japan, and South Korea. I think we'll all be watching to see how serious this connectivity strategy is will be evident by how it is portrayed and leveraged through these institutions and agreements that are already in place. And we shouldn't ignore how valuable that's going to be to get this idea that the connectivity strategy a greater political and diplomatic profile in the months and years ahead. And then thirdly, I think it would be useful if we could hear more from our European friends about this continuing scrutiny of Chinese BRI, particularly BRI projects. I know that the EU wants to be careful about that, but nevertheless, I think it would be welcome, certainly in Australia, to see greater evidence of the EU's effort to scrutinize the Chinese investment, to raise issue with China about things like the 16+1 process, or watching carefully, for example, the outcomes of Italy's recent decision to sign a memorandum of understanding with China to endorse the BRI. That too is going to be something Australians, at least, will be wanting to see. So Europeans, like people in the Indo-Pacific region, recognize that the global dynamics of power and influence are shifting in very unfamiliar ways, but even so it remains the case that while the world is more contested and uncertain, connectivity, engagement remains the best approach to dealing with this more uncertain and difficult environment. And obviously being more deeply connected in Asia, which presents both great opportunity and growing risk, is going to be critically important going forward for virtually all populations, whether you're Australian, European, or elsewhere. So that the connectivity strategy makes sense, but we have to know, I think, more. And I've learned just in this day a great deal more, and I think it would be useful to hear even more back in Australia from the EU about the precise content and resources of the EU Asia connectivity strategy. I said earlier today, it would be useful to get an early kind of win out there, a major infrastructure development project which is properly branded and held out there for all to see as a concrete example of this new strategy. I think if we can see stepped up coordination and commitment of resources by this strategy to work with other like-minded infrastructure development initiatives in the region, that's going to also be a very important signal of how serious this effort is really going to be. And maybe most importantly, outside observers in Australia are going to be watching the EU itself and to see, to gauge the Union's success in addressing the very, very many challenges it faces today, both externally and internally. The Chinese BRI and the challenges it presents to EU unity on the one hand, and to the European way of fiscal, environmental, and social viability on the other, is just one of many, many challenges that the EU is facing going forward. And it will be very interesting to see now how and whether the connectivity strategy can be built up as a way of mitigating and dealing with a lot of the challenges that the EU faces, somewhat along the lines of what we discussed earlier this morning. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much, Dave, for trying to tell John an Australian perspective, and I'm extremely happy to hear that apparently there's some areas left in this world where the European Union is just taken seriously again, or even more, or still, which is quite nice at this time of the day, and this time of electoral campaigns, which haven't really started yet, I think. So we move on to perspectives from the Indo-Pacific, and I think Werner is trying to introduce us to the perspective of Japan.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here, and I think our cooperation is working very nicely. I also see a couple of our researchers sitting in the back. So connectivity is working, it seems, at least in our small part of the world. Well, as an American, I should probably start with a joke. As a Japanese, I should start with an apology. And the apology is obvious. I'm not Japanese, so I will try my best at least to make you a little bit more familiar with the Japanese perspective of the world of the connectivity issues. But of course, I cannot promise to give you the official views of the Japanese government or whatever. So everything I say is a kind of interpretation of how I see it. And let me start. When you talk about connectivity from a Japanese perspective, and I think the Japanese always have China on their mind. This is what is really important. And this is just a few headlines from the newspapers, which shows that Japan is still there. You remember Prime Minister Abe once said Japan is back. So here in the connectivity discipline, we might say Japan is still there. It's not a negligible actor. If you look, for instance, at investment data for Southeast Asia, accumulated over the recent 15 years or so, you see that in many countries, red is Japan, black is China. Japan is still ahead in Vietnam, which is growing so fast. It's actually very far ahead. Malaysia is a different case, but as we heard earlier, Malaysia has been changing track, we might say, very superficial words. So this is quite enlightening in showing us we have to take Japan very seriously. Now, the first part was to explain why has connectivity become such a hot issue. And I argue there's a kind of change in the years around 2008, 9, 10. I will do that very shortly because of time limitation, and then I will rather try to introduce you to how Japan sees it, what Japan does about it, and then also talk about the role of Europe. Now, for the first part, what happened around 2010? First of all, we should take notice that connectivity is not a new idea. I mean, there have been various attempts going at least back to the 1950s, some UN organization trying to do something about it. Also Japan being active in this field when China was still very much occupied with its own internal development. I'll speak more about Japanese activities in a few minutes. So lots of things have been going on, but they didn't really need to lead to these kind of vast and enormous initiatives that we have seen earlier. There are a number of reasons why it didn't happen. I cannot go into it. But around 2010, I think we have an increased interest. One, from a Japanese point of view, frustration with US policies. The expectation that US would take the lead as a kind of benevolent hegemon, you might almost say, but the frustration that they couldn't really rely on US focus on Asia, not even, although that only evolved during those years, Obama's idea of a pivot to Asia, which was looked at rather skeptically, I think, from a Japanese point of view. How was it supposed to work? Second, the identification of major infrastructure bottlenecks. As you know, Japan was investing very actively in the whole region, but they realized there were limits to trade. Actually, trade in the area was already flattening out in those years. And what was behind that? And a basic, very important factor was the infrastructure needs. So we heard about the ADB study of 2016. There was actually also an earlier one in 2008-2009, which was very influential, and there it was stated that the infrastructure needs would be something like $8 trillion until 2020. And nobody really had an idea how that would be covered. Particularly if you looked at what had happened in those years, particularly after and during the financial crisis of 2008-2009, infrastructure lending in the area coming down, the role of multilateral development banks stagnating. So something was about to happen. Final point from the Japanese point of view, China. China was emerging. I mean, 2013, the official start of the Belt and Road Initiative, was obviously not the first year somebody ever thought about interconnectivity in China, so that had a history, and Japan became very concerned. So Japanese activities were also evolving during these years. And without going into more details, let us just now look at what Japan was actually doing. And here I go back a little further now, and I think we all know more or less about the very intensive engagement of Japan with Southeast Asia. So let me rather now take the view from Europe, what happened with respect to Eurasia connectivity. And there we see an early Eurasian diplomacy in the years of Prime Minister Hashimoto, one of the short-lived prime ministers, 1996, 1997, and he wanted to assist, support the transformation, democratization of Eurasia, of Central Asian economies, developing toward market economies. But if you look at it more closely, and we don't really have the time for it, you realize it's very convoluted. It's an amalgam of political, economic ideas, and a few months after the speech he was gone. So that was the first attempt. Nevertheless, they didn't forget about it. In 2004, under Prime Minister Koizumi, there was a so-called Central Asia Plus plan with more concrete proposals what to do. although we have to say Koizumi, well, he reigned a little bit longer, but he had other priorities. And only shortly before he stepped out of office, he visited Central Asian countries, so there was not much prioritization there as well, even though for some time we had the idea of an arc of freedom and prosperity. Again, an amalgam of different ideas about different goals, political goals, economic goals, that didn't really work. Mr. Abe, the current Prime Minister, you may recall that he was Prime Minister before in 2006-2007, and he actually invented, I think he invented, the idea of the Indo-Pacific, so it's not an American idea. And if you look at an excerpt from his speech, he already talked about the 4 countries, US, Japan, Australia, and India working together. You see, in those days, it's more about, it's not very concrete, and again, actually less than a month after he gave that famous speech to the Indian Parliament, he was gone. He was history, at least for the time being. So, failure, basically. And there are, I think, 3 major reasons. First is objectives were blurred. Second, the domestic political instability. And thirdly, also business interests. I think they were not very strong. So we don't have very strong statements from Kedan Ren. They still had other priorities. But then we had the Chinese initiatives developing, we had the lack of infrastructure, and something changed. These are visits of the Prime Minister and the ministers to the area. And what you can see is, if you look at the data closely, these kind of activities do not start with Prime Minister Abe and the Liberal Democrats taking over power again in December 2012, but they actually start earlier. You can already see them in the government of the Democratic Party of Japan, the Progressive Party, you might say, that took over in 2009, and you have important changes during those years. You had a committee being formed on infrastructure issues already in 2010. Promotion headquarters for these kind of stuff. You know, in Japan it is always very important that you start all kind of committees. And that, in a way, this only goes on with the Abe government taking over. They have a similar committee of the cabinet. They call it a little bit different terms. But basically, the idea is the same. And if you look at the objectives, we don't have the time, they are much more concrete. They are much more specific. And they are basically economic. There is only one point, number 3, ensure the safety of Japanese nationals. There have been some cases in those years, but apart, it's a very clear-cut economic strategy. And that is what we see developing. I move over that. This is how it was integrated in government policy. I think we all know about the famous 3 arrows of Abenomics. And actually, infrastructure connectivity is part of it, but it is hidden. It's part of the 3rd arrow. And the 3rd arrow has 3 items it wants to take care of, and one of the 3 items of the 3rd arrow is global outreach. And within global outreach, there is a strategy for getting access to overseas markets, and within that strategy, you have the infrastructure export strategy. So it's somewhere hidden, but it's there. The big splash, in a way, was the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure in 2015. What is important about it? Japan announced it on the occasion of organizing a G7 meeting, so rather conspicuous. They wanted to support quality infrastructure, and that's something we have talked about, or you have talked about a lot before already. It is to be based on the country's development plans. You remember probably that China started with the idea of a kind of form that all the countries had to sign with China, so it was much more hub and spoke approach. So already this idea to take the local or national development plans into consideration can only be understood if you see it as a reaction to what China has been doing, to offer an alternative. Using rather established mechanisms, not trying to start a new one like AIIB, but working through established mechanisms like ADB, which should enhance the credibility of the work, of what has been done. And it is also explicitly beyond Asia. And this became particularly clear also 1 year later when this initiative was extended. The size was increased from $110 billion to $200 billion. Why was it 110 billion before? Well, AIIB had $100 billion. So 110 is a little bit more. But then it was actually extended to $200 billion, and the global reach is very prominent. It's not only about Eurasia. Here are a few examples as part of what is intended. This is an example how they try to work through ADB. As you know, probably an international bank does not only have its own funds, but it can create trust funds. So the idea was that Japan would submit money to those trust funds, and that could be a basis for quality infrastructure investments. That was a very important idea in this context. We also have a few new mechanisms. We have JOIN, for instance, which was supposed to be a collaboration between state and industry. You see the role of industry is very prominent, already established in 2014. However, if you look at the capital structure, 40 billion yen out of 46 billion yen were to come from the state, so it's very much state dominated. And actually the level is rather small, and industry was not so satisfied, so actually a few years later, not giving up the idea of JOIN, but a second initiative was started, the Japan Infrastructure Initiative, and that is more or less run by companies. Right, so it's part of the strategy, but it's really with a very strong focus of industry influence. Another aspect of PQI is that they try to get their idea of quality and what I call prudence in terms of governance, prudent governance mechanism. Quality is technical. Prudence is rather regulatory rules, as they have been called before, on the international agenda. And that happened very early. That already happened in 2016. That also happened in the G20 meeting of 2016, which took place in China. And interestingly, I might almost say Japan smuggled something like this into the G20 statement. And it goes on. APEC has a statement on quality infrastructure 2018. Engaging OECD, so there has been preparatory work, exactly as it was suggested by Bates about using G20 meeting in 2019, which is chaired by Japan for this purpose. So they had a meeting in September 2018, and just in March there was a big conference in Berlin with very prominent speakers trying to get some cooperation between Germans, Europeans and Japan going in preparation for G20. A short word on Japan's mini-lateral initiatives, as I call them, engaging with selected other countries, including India, including Australia. And here the idea of free and open Indo-Pacific comes to mind again. Don't really have the time to go in details, but Abe has more speeches on that, so he continued promoting the idea of Indo-Pacific when he became Prime Minister again. He developed the idea later on. I still wonder whether free and open Indo-Pacific will be that important for Japan. I mean, this is my personal opinion now. I think if you look at what's been going on in Japanese media, it's still seen as something where the substance has to become very clear. One issue is, for instance, that the four countries, the Quad countries, are very diverse in terms of their economic situation, their political systems, and so on. So will it really be a lasting alliance? From a Japanese point of view, we currently rather have the two initiatives side by side. This is a chart from a Japanese policy paper. This is about, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs policy priorities in 2017. And you see three key areas. One is international peace and stability, and free and open Indo-Pacific is mentioned in that context. So yes, it contains elements of infrastructure development, but it is rather seen as a political move. Then we have sustainability, I'm not talking about that now. And then key area 3 is the economic diplomacy, quality growth. So this is about economics, and PQI is mentioned in that context. No? So we have those two contexts, and my personal take on this is that PQI will be the more enduring one. The initiative is very well known. I don't want to go into the details, but I want to show you this picture. I did a Google Trends analysis, how often the term BRI and PQI is looked at internationally. And you see BRI has a lot of international interest, and hardly anyone knows about PQI, but as I hoped I could convince you, it's actually there. Also Indo-Pacific, it's not there yet, right? So it's not growing so fast. Anyway, finally, just one or two remarks, role of Europe. And now here I see it from the perspective, should Europe engage with Japan? First, if you look at the communication, and I took the September 2018 joint communication as a starting point. Personally, I'm a little bit disappointed. Maybe I'm a little bit more disappointed than you are. You seem to have found some more stronger arguments of the EU. I was disappointed. And when looking at what they had to say about Japan and China, I saw a rather eco-distant, very careful, very unclear argumentation. And personally, I think it has to become much clearer to deserve to be called a strategy. Well, we have to be honest and say this is building blocks for a strategy, as they call it, but I think there's much more work to do. So what could be part of a strategy? First point, I think infrastructure cooperation and connectivity should be one of the major aspects of the strategic partnership agreement. Actually, many issues are mentioned in the partnership agreement, but infrastructure, connectivity are missing. You don't find them in the text, although you could focus on them, because there is multilateral cooperation, there's development cooperation, there's also industrial cooperation. So I think we should make it a real focal point of strategic discussions between Japan and the EU. EU and Japan definitely have a common interest on a multilateral level in terms of securing the rules, as you called them before, or the standards. We, both EU and Japan, are focusing on high quality. That's sure, we don't have a price advantage. So we have to focus on quality, and that's where our interests on the multilateral meet. On the regional level, well, should there be a focal point for cooperation? Yes, I see some. It's Africa. Africa is very strong on the mind of Europeans these days. It's also on the mind of Japanese, and I think this would be something to cooperate. It's also Eastern Europe. To some extent, I have to be very frank because I don't have any time left. You know, the 16+1 process is a little bit disturbing. We do not really see an intention of Japan to divide, that's too strong, but to divide the European Union. So I think Japan would be a very good partner for Europe to develop a project, because Japan doesn't have a political interest in Eastern Europe. So I think we can develop very helpful economic projects there. And Middle East could be another area where we both can interact. If we have to make a choice, I think PQI is a better alternative for being a platform for such projects than Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Although some European countries have been asked, actually, explicitly asked, also by Abe, mentioned in his speeches, to join. And interestingly, UK and France were mentioned. You can guess why. The two are the only ones with a serious seawater fleet. So from the security aspects, free sea lanes and so on, only UK and France can be serious partners for Free and Open Indo-Pacific. But I think that's also at the same time the point that makes it difficult for Europe. No? Even if FOAP has some economic aspects, it's more or less a rather political, strategic aspect, clearly against one other country, and from a European point of view it would also be a little bit divisive, because only some countries could seriously be part of it. So I don't think it would be such a helpful platform, whereas PQI, which is not against anyone and has serious economic interest, definitely is. Sorry, I hastened a little bit, but I hope you could follow my arguments, and thank you very much for your interest.
After this continuation of broad perspective, I would be surprised if there weren't any major expressions of interest from the floor, which I here would like to. Ali, please.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentations. My question is more on the strategic and military aspect that you've already touched upon. So, as you've explained, the EU is not fit to be a military actor in the region, but would it be wise for Japan, for example, to target or to boost their ties with countries that recently China has been engaging in, for example, dual-use ports such as Gwadar, or in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port? Should PQI maybe extend a hand to Pakistan, for example, or Sri Lanka in trying to boost economic development in those countries?
Perhaps we take the second question on board. Mark, please.
Thank you
very much.
More of a comment than a question. I'm just thinking about some commonalities among the two presentations, which were excellent. And I'm thinking that another region which tends to get left out of the dialogue, which is very important when we talk about Asia connectivity, is the South Pacific, the Pacific Islands. The reason for that is not only do you have pretty much an official confirmation that the Belt and Road has started to extend into that particular part of the world, but we're starting to see increased policies among some European countries. I'm thinking primarily France. You have China and Japan both stepping up their aid diplomacy there, and in some cases in direct competition. And you also have Australia and New Zealand trying to redefine or reset or reboot their kind of traditional roles in the area. And you could argue that much of this is being kind of spurred on by China. And remembering last year there was panic for about 24 hours. A report came out that China was about to set up a Navy base in Vanuatu. It turned out to be completely incorrect. But we're just wondering if you can comment on where the Pacific Islands might fit in with the idea of connectivity and the possibility of some of the convergences that you talk about.
I want also maybe to comment in some way and ask your insights on corporate level, Japan business. So we're talking about China, we are talking about state initiative, but talking about Japan, the activities of multinational business, Japanese multinational business is very active in energy, in resources, in education, in all spheres. So maybe cultural sphere is not so, but sometimes even culture. So maybe the scheme of cooperation on business level is a way to develop this initiative of connectivity from the side of Japan.
Perhaps we keep the
Yeah, just a very tiny remark. I would tend to question the assertion that PQI is not against anybody. I mean, the mere expression, quality infrastructure, is what targets China, which provides bad quality infrastructure precisely. So it's just a remark, but I think it's quite obvious that it is against somebody. I mean, it's the way of providing infrastructure is much better if it's provided by the Japanese compared to the Chinese, so it's clearly against China. So it's just a side remark, but I think it's quite obvious.
Now we have two questions to comment and answer. I'm not sure. Do we swap? And Werner, you might go first this time.
Yes, fine. I mean, definitely about dual use purposes. I mean, definitely Japanese government organizations and so on are thinking in those terms, and you definitely see that. And of course, maybe I've oversimplified in saying there's either PQI or there's FOIP. I mean, it's not that strict, right? When you actually talk about projects, is it part of FOIP or is it part of PQI? You give it a certain label, obviously, but that doesn't mean that the kind of the substantial policy is certainly also directed to some extent for military or dual use purposes, when they support ports or things like that. That's quite obvious. Or I think our India colleagues can comment much better about it. The support for India and the mutual interest with India, of course, have a very strong military context as well. No? There is an agreement last year for logistical support between the navies. I think it concerns the navies. So there is a strong element like that. Pacific Islands, I cannot really comment very much on that. Yes, I'm aware, of course, that it is of interest for the Japanese side as well, not only recently, but whether there is anything very specific, I'm really not the right person to try to give a serious answer. Yes, corporate level, the business. Yes, I think that's very important. I try to make that clear that the business side is a very important aspect. To some extent, it's out of necessity because the Japanese government simply doesn't have so much money to venture on a similar path as China would. So they have to see themselves as a partner of the business world, and they also have to adjust their policies accordingly. And a lot of the work that is currently going on also in the academic world in thinking about how can we make the PQI alive is about finding the appropriate governance mechanisms between state and business players. So, for instance, public-private partnerships. Now that's a big issue. How do you build railroads? How do you build roads? Usually it will be some kind of public-private partnership, but we know from experience PPP doesn't always work. The incentives are not always there. If you just give someone money to build something, but you don't care about the quality of the road in 10 years ahead, and there is no incentive for the contractor to look at it, he will not supply decent work. So somehow you have to find incentive mechanisms to adjust the incentives of all the players. And this is something the Japanese are very serious about and are trying to do. And I think with their kind of experience in so many international projects they already have, but also in domestic projects, they really have a comparative advantage. And that leads me to the last question. Well, maybe it's a question of terminology, but I think, I see PQI as a business proposition. And of course, it challenges another business proposition that is already there. So there is competition. You compete for the international infrastructure market. And of course you define your own strategy. That's what all major companies and also smaller companies would do. So is that something against another supplier? No, I think you define your own strategic position and see how you can advance it. So from that point of view, I think it's different from a political opposition. Because the difference is that the demand side has a choice, right? The choice is that if finally, after everything has been said and done, is with the demand side. You make a proposal, and the other party can choose, and that is very different from defining a political strategy against a, let's call it, opponent.
I think, Mark, you have raised an important point, because we have seen Australia, New Zealand, Japan, even the United States, putting forward, a lot more active in the way of putting forward infrastructure development initiatives in the Pacific Islands, right? And so, presumably, that again might be an area where the new EU initiative could connect. So, for example, you've got this, in Australia they just launched something called the, what was it called? Oh, the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, right? It's about 1.5 billion US dollars, 2 billion Australian for infrastructure development in the Pacific nations. You had this recent memorandum of understanding signed between JBIC, that's the Japan Bank of International Cooperation, OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation in the United States, which is going to get a new name later this year, and their counterpart in Australia, which is called EFIC, the Export Finance and Insurance Corporation. They've signed a memorandum of understanding pledging to do work together. Nothing has come of it yet. That was signed in November. I'm just going to be some time before we see anything there. But again, this is, I think, what I was getting at, that as the European strategy gets stood up, it would be, I'm presuming, a no-brainer that they would want to sit down with these various initiatives and counterpart organizations precisely to find out what they're doing and see if they can have a seat at the table and maybe make a contribution to some of these developments in the Pacific Islands. I think it's a great idea. One question I would have, though, thinking about this sort of from a political science perspective, it's easy to suggest to governments that they should sit down and coordinate and cooperate. But of course, governments want to have their own credit, right? They want to be the stars of their own show, right? And so I think that's often, unfortunately, an obstacle, because the EU doesn't want to simply be the fourth name on a list of donors. The EU wants to come in and be the maitre d' of whatever new and interesting, exciting development project there might be. So I can see where, well, in principle, working with other institutions and organizations makes sense. I can see where politically it could be difficult.
Thank you very much. Next round of questions and comments. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just thinking about the political paradigm that actually all the professors here talking about connectivity want to use. I'm just afraid of talking about connectivity if you put it in the context of old paradigm of international system. It will just results on what kind such kind of exclusivity, dominance, and inequality. But what I don't know whether you have a suggestion or some ideas about the framework of global governance that will bring about some more optimism in terms of fairness, in which all the interactions among the key players in this global issue, non-hierarchy, in the characters of non-hierarchy, engage all stakeholders, not only from public sectors or governments or nation states, but also non-state actors like a business, even civil societies, and other subnational governments, which is related to the implementations of the policies resulted from the international negotiations. What also is important is about norms. What's global norms that all these key players. What I mean by key players is like EU, Japan, China, and also United States would like to apply, because as far as I know, global business society have already UN Global Compact that stated clearly about some principal norms in which their global business operations should take place. But I'm still wondering whether the key players of nation states that talk much and have a big interest on connectivity issue will take into account what kind of norms they want to apply in such a complexity of issues. I think that's my comment, and I need some response from the distinguished speakers. And then the second question, if I may, to Professor Pascha. Yeah. In your recommendations, you said that the priority of EU should be in the regional level should be on the Middle East, Africa, and
Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe. Yeah. I don't know. Sorry, maybe I missed, but it's not clear enough. Why don't you go to the Southeast Asia, as I suggested? Is it because EU doesn't want to get in a competition between China and Japan? Because from an Indonesian perspective, BRI is just considered as the competition between China and Japan, and it's not really resulted in more quality of public infrastructures and also some other basic improvement in terms of quality of our people. So I don't know, maybe you can more explanation on that issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for comment and question. We still don't have time for...
As a follow-up question, there are also kind of broad organizations like UN Economic and Social Council for Asia-Pacific, or Asia-Pacific Economic Council, Cooperation, IPEEAR, which include both the countries you were talking about and many other countries in Asia-Pacific, and which are also established institutions which also have some kind of cooperation with outside structures like the European Union. What role do you think they could play eventually in enhancing cooperation in the Pacific area itself and between the Pacific and, say, Europe or other regions? Thank you.
Well, just as a follow-up, I was intrigued by your choice of possible options for Japan-EU cooperation. Africa, I would say, is too vast So what? So what regions, like sub-regions within the continent you're looking at, and if you have any specific suggestions on that? I thought Middle East is one region where nobody would, at least Japan is not going to invest money for obvious reasons. Domestic politics is one, and the conflicts that are going on in Middle East is the other one. But more importantly, the money, as you said, PQI is not just about investment, it is also about making a statement that Japan has got money, it has got funds, and it can also support the countries. So that, I would say, is missing in Middle East. Why would you invest money in Middle East where you don't have your competitors? Compared to that region, I would say Central Asia, South Asia, the Pacific, where China and Taiwan actually are at loggerheads, but could be a possibility. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Very last question. Otherwise, I might avail of the privilege of moving now from chair to somebody who would like to join the discussion. And perhaps, I think Sebastian knows about my deepest respect for his chair, to enter into territory which might deem not to be as polite as the distinguished speakers. But I mean, I used to attend the occasional conference on EU-China relations, and I'm quite surprised about this very, very positive perspective of the European Union and its political capacity over the state. I mean, of course, everyone raised an issue: will the EU have the resources? You have to follow up policies. Does it still have the capacity to do something? But now I would be really curious. I fully understand the polite start to join when chair organized workshop, but are Japan, is Australia really still so positive towards the European Union at this stage of development? Or is all these talk about connectivity, Eurasian strategies with the European Union, you know, something which you still have to say as long as this partner still exists? But I would have hoped there's some contingency planning for the EU getting into an even deeper crisis and into deeper trouble, particularly if the, and now Werner, please correct me, but I think economists talk about increasing downside risks of the global economy, might make it even more complicated to leverage all those great funds and turn 60 billion euro of the European Union into 850 billion euro of investment and things. So now, are we talking about joint communiques at the end of summits, or is there real belief in the European Union will continue to be a reliable partner in all these endeavors? And apologies, but I think we have a close list of questions and comments. Last time Werner had the first go, perhaps now Kate, you might start.
All right, well, a couple of comments I guess I could respond. As I understood your remarks, it seemed to be expressing a concern as to how well all of these new infrastructure development initiatives are going to be responsive to the needs of the populations and to the civil society that is going to be most affected. I think that's a fair question. Of course, if you read through you've probably read the EU-Asia connectivity strategy, and I think it's quite clear from that document, at least in principle, the types of norms and rules that the EU proposes be followed, right? And it's pretty clear that I think they're trying to cast a sort of an alternative vision around those norms in comparison to the way China's been criticized. So I think you can see what the language is. It's quite clear. I guess the more important question is just how serious is it really, and that's the question you're getting at. And I think maybe I'm a Europhile. I am, and always have been. And so maybe I have a overly optimistic expectation. But I think I tried to pepper my remarks by saying that there is some skepticism, and I think we have to acknowledge the enormous challenges that stand in front of the EU that have nothing to do with Asia connectivity at all, right? So the proof will be if we see something come out of this. If it's yet another EU strategy that goes nowhere, it will be very disappointing, I think, for a lot of people. But I'm a little bit more optimistic, I guess, naively. I want to also comment on the question that you raised about some of the other organizations that are already there. I'm not really a specialist in infrastructure development, but one point that's been hammered home to me in looking at it over the last couple of months is precisely the role of the business sector. I mean, organizations like OPIC, like EFIC, like JBIC, this is not government money. It's not. It's facilitating private lending to come to, because at the end of the day, it's going to be private sector that has to deliver the goods. I mean, the governments aren't going to be building roads and building dams and so on and so forth. They have to go to the private sector. So I guess one answer to your question, I think, has to be those organizations are probably potentially useful, but can they leverage the private sector? That's the key thing here for infrastructure development. And if they don't have the capacity or the facility to partner and attract private sector investment in the infrastructure projects, then they're nothing more than sort of talk shops, really. And that's something I think we often forget, is that this is at least the way that Japan thinks about it, the way that the United States thinks about it, the way that Australia thinks about it, and presumably the way that the EU needs to think about it, is how do we make this attractive to our private sectors to take the risk and seek profit. And otherwise, we're simply talking about development aid, and that's something completely different. Development aid is something very different from what we're talking about, which is infrastructure development by the private sector, primarily.
Yeah, thank you. I think there were two sets of questions, maybe one about governance mechanisms and the other about regions. Now, with respect to governance, I mean, I'm an economist, and basically I think of infrastructure as a market. And it's a huge market. It's now roughly 14% of global GDP. And it's a growing market, whereas trade is stagnating, and countries and their companies have problems to increase trade further, whether you think of it in a positive way or not, but they will consider it a problem. Whereas trade is stagnating or even declining, we're talking about peak globalization. The infrastructure market is growing, and it's growing strongly. It's billions and billions, and you see the dollar signs in the eyes of the parties. And to a considerable extent, that market is a zero-sum market. Either you build the road from A to B, or there will be no other deal, because a second road from A to B doesn't make economic sense. So a lot of infrastructure is characterized by so-called, what we call natural monopolies. And if that's a business, and nation states have developed an interest in that, I think that the established institutions in the UN context, for instance, currently do not have a chance anymore. Maybe they had it if these kind of initiatives that I was also mentioning, would have developed more strongly 20 years ago, but now that we have things like ERI and PQI, it's too late, and they have realized it's a business. Now, can we expect stakeholders to really make an impact? Not in a direct way, but markets are also governed or regulated. For instance, we have the Global Sustainable Development Goals. And if these goals are to be taken seriously, and if even autocratic governments at some stage have to ask themselves, well, I built that dam, but water a dam, but I didn't care about sustainable development goals. So in the future, maybe 5 years down the road, they will have problems. So if you have such a kind of framework, all kinds of governments will look into those kind of rules, for instance, sustainability goals. And that's an argument for building competence and also simply for building competitive advantage in the market. If you are the one who can supply projects in line with sustainable development goals, for instance, there's a really good chance that sustainable development goals will be taken care of the way they were considered by those who have been setting that up in a marketplace. And this is a position that some players are seeking quite deliberately to strengthen their competitive situation on the market. And here we are back to Francois' question in a way. So from that point of view, if you look at the market dynamics, I'm not so pessimistic that there is no chance to take care of such goals. Is the EU still a viable player? Well, not in terms of throwing money at projects, I totally agree. But I mean, if we are selective for some issues, yes, they can be serious. For instance, making sure that these kind of quality and prudence mechanisms are well defined, are also defined in the interest of European companies, and are defined in a way on a multilateral level that also makes them binding, in the sense that you can only get money from the World Bank or from multilateral development banks if certain rules of prudence, of governance are fulfilled. That's something in the interest of the EU, which doesn't really cost money, because it means cooperation in international formats like G7 or G20 and OECD and so on. And I don't really see why the EU shouldn't get their act together to cooperate in such a way with Japan and maybe others. As for the regions, yes, I agree. I would certainly have to think about the regions again. But in a way, it follows from this kind of discussion. I mean, we cannot expect the EU to be present everywhere. And I think you were quite right to say even Africa is too big, so there should be a certain focal point. And those kind of focal points should be in the interest of both players. And in some areas, actually, like Bates suggested, I think the role of the EU would be too small. There would simply be a junior player, and why should they be interested to be on the baby seat next to Japan in negotiations? But there are other areas that are very central from a European point of view, and maybe where there is also common interest. And basically, I see. Sorry to be so general, but Africa in that kind of position. I mean, Africa has a certain role for Japan. It's also part of the India-Japan cooperation, this growth corridor turning towards Africa. And as we all know, we have to do some, from a European point of view, we have to do something about developing Africa because of migration and so on, without going into the details. So I really see a possibility to cooperate there. About other areas, yes, Middle East or Eastern Europe, well, thank you very much for the suggestions. I think I should think it over again. Yes, thanks.
I think that quite a few of these points will turn up again tomorrow morning, when, as my program tells me, we will have the very first panel explicitly now on the big elephant in the room, the Belt and Road Initiative of the People's Republic of China. One smaller point I'm personally looking really forward after this panel to see how this is taken up tomorrow is this perspective on infrastructure being a market, which should be predominantly be taken care of by companies, which I think becomes more and more disputed area in Europe. How much of infrastructure actually can be privatized, can be left to private supply, while at the same time everyone suddenly talks about critical infrastructure, which needs to be protected. Again, something I am quite sure we will come back to tomorrow morning in panel 4. At this stage, I think what we all really ought to do is thank these two distinguished speakers for an excellent job in presenting their ideas and answering questions and comments.